The applause that welcomed Chris Hemsworth rolled through the studio like a friendly wave, practiced and polished, the kind that carried no surprises. He rose briefly from his chair, giving a modest nod and that familiar half-smile audiences had come to trust, confident but not arrogant, relaxed yet attentive. The set of The View glowed with its usual morning warmth, soft pastels, gleaming coffee mugs, cameras gliding silently on tracks. Everything felt routine, comfortable, almost scripted. And yet, beneath that surface calm, there was an undercurrent Chris couldn't quite name, a subtle sense that this interview would not glide by on charm alone. Joy Behar watched him closely from behind her glasses, her posture casual but her eyes alert. She had interviewed hundreds of celebrities, maybe thousands, and she knew how to wait. The conversation flowed easily at first, talk of new films, training routines, family life back in Australia. Chris laughed when expected, answered thoughtfully when prompted, and even teased himself when Joy joked about superheroes aging out of their capes. The audience responded warmly, reacting on cue, as if this were just another pleasant celebrity stop on a weekday morning. But Joy's questions had a way of curving when least expected. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbow on the table, fingers loosely wrapped around her mug. Her voice softened, not sharpened, which made the shift more noticeable. She framed the question carefully, starting broad, about influence, about how people project meaning onto characters larger than life. Then she narrowed it, gently but unmistakably, toward Chris himself. Toward what it means to be seen as a symbol. Toward whether actors who portray strength owe the public something more than entertainment. Chris felt the change before the question fully landed. His smile remained, but something behind it tightened. He inhaled, ready to respond the way he had dozens of times before, with a practiced balance of humility and humor. Yet as Joy finished speaking, the words didn't immediately arrange themselves. Instead, memories surfaced uninvited, fan letters from parents, comments from strangers who spoke of Thor as if he were real, expectations he never agreed to but somehow carried anyway. The room felt warmer, the lights brighter. He opened his mouth, and stopped. For a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but real, Chris hesitated. Not the kind of pause meant for drama, not a television trick. This was a genuine interruption in his own rhythm, like stepping forward and realizing the ground might not be where you expected. His jaw shifted slightly as he closed his mouth again. The audience, trained to respond instantly, went quiet instead. Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer glanced up, alert. Joy noticed. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to rephrase or soften the question. She simply watched him, head tilted just enough to signal interest rather than challenge. Years in live television had taught her when to press and when to let silence do the work. This, she sensed, was one of those moments. Chris glanced briefly toward the other co-hosts, as if checking the emotional temperature of the table. Whoopi Goldberg sat back, expression unreadable but attentive. Sunny Hostin's gaze stayed fixed on him, curious, analytical. Sarah Haynes leaned forward just slightly, sensing something unscripted unfolding. The cameras stayed trained on Chris's face, catching the micro-expressions no movie close-up ever could. He felt an unexpected pressure, not hostile, not aggressive, but intimate. The kind that comes when you realize you're being asked to speak not as a character, not even as a celebrity, but as yourself. He had answered difficult questions before. About fame. About masculinity. About expectations. Yet this one felt different because it wasn't asking him to defend anything. It was asking him to define something. Time stretched in that quiet pocket. In his mind, he weighed responses. A light answer would keep things moving, earn a laugh, maintain the show's easy rhythm. A more serious answer could open doors he wasn't sure he wanted to walk through on live television. He thought of his kids, too young to understand the world's projections but old enough to one day look back at moments like this. He thought of the audience beyond the studio, people watching at home, interpreting not just his words but his tone, his posture, his pause. The hesitation deepened, though outwardly he remained composed. His fingers interlaced on the table, knuckles pressing together, a grounding gesture he barely noticed himself making. He exhaled slowly through his nose, steadying his thoughts. This wasn't about winning a point or deflecting a question. It was about choosing honesty without unraveling something private. Joy broke the silence only with her eyes, raising her eyebrows just a touch, not impatient but encouraging. The audience remained still, sensing that whatever came next would matter more because of the pause that preceded it. Silence on live TV can feel dangerous, but this one felt deliberate, almost sacred. Chris finally leaned back slightly, as if creating space for the answer he hadn't yet found. The smile he wore earlier had softened into something more thoughtful, more human. He looked out toward the audience, not the cameras this time, but the people beyond them, and then back to Joy. Still, he didn't speak yet. The moment lingered, suspended between expectation and revelation, shaped not by confrontation but by consideration. In that hesitation, the interview shifted from performance to presence. Whatever answer Chris Hemsworth would give, it was clear now that it wouldn't be automatic. It would be chosen. When Chris finally spoke, the sound of his voice seemed to settle the room rather than fill it. It was lower than before, measured, as though each word had been tested for weight before being released. He began by acknowledging the question itself, not dodging it, not reframing it, but meeting it head-on. He admitted that there are days when he feels comfortable carrying the expectations people place on him, and other days when that same weight feels borrowed, even undeserved. As he talked, his hands moved slowly, not for emphasis but as if shaping the idea in front of him. He explained that playing strength on screen is easy because it's scripted, rehearsed, and ultimately temporary. Real strength, he said, shows up in uncertainty, in restraint, in moments when silence is more responsible than confidence. The audience leaned in without realizing it, drawn by the lack of polish in his delivery. This wasn't a soundbite. It was a reflection unfolding in real time. Joy listened carefully, her expression no longer teasing or sharp but thoughtful. She nodded once, subtly, as if recognizing something familiar in his words. Chris went on, describing how fame has a strange way of amplifying voices you didn't know you had. People listen even when you're not sure you should be speaking. That awareness, he said, creates hesitation, not fear, but responsibility. He paused again briefly, though this time the silence felt intentional rather than searching. The co-hosts remained quiet, sensing that interrupting would break something delicate. Sunny's eyes softened, Sarah's lips pressed into a small, reflective smile. Even Whoopi, usually quick with a reaction, stayed still. The audience didn't clap. They didn't laugh. They listened. Chris admitted that he doesn't always get it right. That sometimes he answers too quickly, relying on charm or humor when a situation calls for thought. He gestured lightly toward Joy, acknowledging that her question had caught him in one of those rare moments where instinct failed and reflection took over. Instead of weakening him, the admission seemed to ground him. The hesitation that had felt risky now revealed itself as the most honest part of the exchange. Joy finally responded, not with a rebuttal but with curiosity. She remarked that hesitation is often misread as uncertainty, when in reality it can be a sign of respect, for the question, for the audience, for the truth. Her tone was gentle, almost appreciative. The tension that many had anticipated never arrived. Instead, the conversation opened outward, becoming less about debate and more about shared understanding. Chris smiled then, not the practiced interview smile but a genuine one, small and relieved. He agreed, adding that slowing down has become more important to him over time, especially in a world that rewards immediacy. He spoke about learning to sit with questions, to allow discomfort to exist without rushing to resolve it. As he spoke, the audience began to respond, not loudly, but with murmurs of agreement, nods, a quiet sense of recognition. The director likely wanted to move on, to keep the show's pace intact, but no one rushed the moment. Live television has rules, but it also has instincts, and this exchange had found something worth lingering on. Joy cracked a light joke to ease the atmosphere, but even that carried a note of warmth rather than deflection. Laughter followed, gentle and appreciative, like a release valve opening slowly. As the conversation shifted toward the next topic, the energy in the studio had changed. The earlier brightness returned, but it was layered now, textured by what had just occurred. Chris answered the following questions smoothly, but with a new attentiveness, as if the hesitation had recalibrated his presence. The audience applauded more freely, not because they were prompted, but because they felt included in something unscripted. During a brief break, the co-hosts leaned toward Chris, offering quiet comments of respect and thanks. He nodded, appreciative but still thoughtful, as though the conversation continued internally even as the cameras reset. When the show returned from commercial, Joy glanced at him once more, a knowing look passing between them. No words were needed. By the time the interview wrapped, social media producers backstage were already buzzing, sensing that this wasn't a viral clash or a headline-grabbing argument, but something subtler, and perhaps more lasting. A moment where a pause spoke as loudly as any declaration. As Chris stood to leave, the audience rose in applause, stronger this time, carrying gratitude rather than excitement. He waved, thanked the hosts, and walked off stage with the same calm energy he'd arrived with, but changed in a way only he could fully feel. The hesitation that had momentarily stalled him had ultimately clarified something essential. In choosing not to rush, he had allowed authenticity to surface, reshaping the moment into something meaningful. Later, viewers would replay the clip, analyzing the pause, the tone, the expressions. Some would call it brave. Others would call it thoughtful. But for those who had been in the room, or watching closely, it was simply human. And in a space built for noise, that quiet decision to hesitate had said everything.